Okay, so thank you everyone for your patience. Welcome to round one. We're going to get started. Before we do, well, I guess let's first call the case of State versus West Carolina versus Timothy Ray. My name is Judge Emily Van Oosting. I've already confirmed that there are no conflicts. If we could make sure that everybody who needs their video off has it off, which they do, very good. Okay, so if we could please, can I have the attorney start by making their appearances? We'll start with the state.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Mackenzie Earhart, spelled E-H-R-H-A-R-D-T. Myself and my co-counsel.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Jordan Holzberg. My last name is spelled H-U-L-S-E-B-E-R-G.
Perfect. Thank you, state and defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Riley Davis, and along with my co-counsel, Mr. Nicholas Patty, we have the pleasure of representing Mr. Timothy Ray in today's case. We have a notice of appearance prepared. Would you like for us to drop that in the chat?
I think we're okay. Everybody has their name up on their screen, so good job.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, so before we get started even with preliminary matters, if I could, I have a request from the competition, just that for right now, can everybody make sure they are in speaker view instead of gallery view?
Good.
Perfect. And well, let's start with the state. Are there any preliminary matters before we get started?
Yes, Your Honor. And just for the record, we are team 101 for everybody to annotate. We have just a few housekeeping matters that we would like to address first, and then a few procedural matters as well.
Okay, go ahead with your preliminary matters.
Yes, Your Honor. May we assume that the witnesses are pre-sworn?
Yes.
And Your Honor, may we move about our virtual wells freely for closings, openings, and our examinations?
Yes, you may.
Pursuant to Federal Rule of Evidence 615, we would like to invoke the rule of sequestration. Now, Your Honor, we understand that there are expert witnesses in this case, and they may be permitted to stay in our virtual courtroom. However, we would ask that the fact witnesses be sequestered.
And defense, do you have any objection to that?
No objection, Your Honor, just that Dr. Shane Riley be allowed to stay in the courtroom today.
Of course, the experts may stay in, so that's granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And then for our last housekeeping matter, we have a unique sort of trial today in the Zoom forum. We do have some exhibits that we are going to discuss shortly when we get into the substantive matters. Once we have admitted those exhibits, may we publish those freely to the court?
I ask that you ask before you publish.
Understood, Your Honor. And that concludes our housekeeping matters, Your Honor, if the defense has any.
Okay, defense, do you have any housekeeping matters?
Yes, Your Honor. First, there are some stipulations in this case. Would you prefer us to read them in now or as they become relevant?
I will leave that up to you, however you'd like to do it.
Yes, Your Honor. We'd also like to put the court on notice that today, when offering evidence, we will direct court, counsel, and jurors to the page number and exhibit number in the digital notebook. That's just how we are going to admit evidence under the local rules.
That's fine.
Your Honor, we intend to offer an expert in forensic psychiatry today. Would you prefer for us to formally tender this expert witness or lay the foundation and move on?
I would ask that you formally tender.
Yes, Your Honor. Before we get too far into the substantive matters, we had a conversation with opposing counsel before trial, and for the purposes of time, we have stipulated to admit certain evidence. Would you like to hear that list now?
I would, please.
Yes, Your Honor. We stipulated to admit Exhibit 6 on page 53.
Okay.
Exhibit 7 on page 54. Exhibit 22 on page 99. Exhibit 27 on page 104. And then Exhibit 17A and B, which is found on page 93 and 94 of the digital notebook.
Okay, so just so I can confirm I have that correct, it's 6, 7, 22, 27, and then 17A and B. Both sides agree those are in?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Your Honor, that's correct.
All right, they're in.
And for the purposes of our evidentiary arguments today, can we assume that all sidebars are constructive for the jury to still be able to score them?
I ask that you ask to approach as if we were in a courtroom, but of course, yes, they are going to still be on the screen for everybody to hear.
Yes, Your Honor, and that's all the housekeeping matters that we have.
Okay. Does anybody have any motions in limine, or may we proceed to openings?
Your Honor, the prosecution has no motions in limine today. However, we do have two additional stipulations that we had with opposing counsel prior to the proceedings today. Just for the record, all of the exhibits were correct. Those were what we all agreed on. We also agreed that the identification of the defendant has been proper and has occurred, and also that this is the appropriate forum for jurisdiction.
Perfect. Okay. Any other preliminary matters by either side?
Yes, Your Honor. Defense did have a motion in limine, but we discussed with opposing counsel pre-trial, and we agreed to exclude Exhibit 18 through 21, which are the photographs of Nathan Ray after he was buried.
Okay, and state, is that correct? You agree that 18 and 21 will not be coming in during this trial?
Yes, Your Honor, no objection from the state.
Okay. All right, well then in that case, I believe we are getting ready to go to openings, at which point I am instructed to tell you all to go back to gallery view. There you go. All right, state, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Whenever you're ready.
Fight or flight. It's our basic instinct. It's raw, it's fear, it's life or death. But there's a third choice, and you'll learn about it today. It's the choice the defendant made. Fake it. You'll learn the defendant was stopped at a routine DUI checkpoint 2 days after he strangled his son, just after he had buried the 6-year-old's body. Large garbage bags, bleach, shovel were even still in the car, and they were all seen by the officer. Too weak to fight and too slow for flight, the defendant chose to fake a mental illness. And I'll say that again. You'll learn today that the defendant killed his son, and now, after being caught red-handed, wants you to believe he's not responsible because he suddenly has a mental illness. But after you hear what the facts say and what our expert says, you'll know who was responsible. Fight, flight, or fake it. Here's what the facts say. You'll learn that just before the defendant strangled his son, his ex-wife dropped Nathan off at the defendant's home. The two were separated and feuding after the wife's recent affair became public. But she was panicked when she went to pick up Nathan from school, and he wasn't there. Instead, Nathan's teacher told her that Nathan hadn't been to school for the past 2 days. Who was responsible for Nathan those past 2 days? The defendant. The defendant was the one responsible. In fact, the evidence will show that Nathan was spending a few days. He spilled some apple juice on his dad's work laptop. And the defendant raises his voice and begins screaming at his 6-year-old son. He screams to the point that Nathan flees to his room. And when the defendant arrives to his crying son, he screams at him some more, but too much was never enough for the defendant. The defendant screams at Nathan, but it wasn't enough. He orders him to do jumping jacks, but it wasn't enough. He orders him to do high knees, and it still wasn't enough. You'll learn that no punishment was enough for the defendant. And so the defendant went to his own room to grab his belt. But before he grabbed that belt, he sat down in his bed to try and calm down. But he chose to continue. And he walked back to Nathan's room, belt in hand. And when he returned to Nathan, Nathan continued screaming. And you've got to wonder what was going through the mind of a 6-year-old boy, not understanding what he did to deserve this. And in his last few moments, Nathan fought back and screamed, "I hate you!" And the defendant wrapped the belt around Nathan's neck and pulled it tight. He pulled it until Nathan stopped screaming. He pulled it until Nathan stopped kicking. He pulled it until the blood vessels in Nathan's eyes burst. The defendant didn't shoot Nathan. He didn't stab him. He didn't kill him instantly. He took the time to strangle him. He took the time. And Nathan's last few seconds alive were spent begging, "I want my mom. Please, I want my mom." And we know all of this. All of the gritty details because they came straight out of the defendant's mouth. He confessed every word to the police. And you know what? You'll learn that everything was found exactly where the defendant said it would be. The police found Nathan's body buried exactly where the defendant said he buried it. The police found spilled juice on the countertop exactly where the defendant said it all started. The police even found a belt in Nathan's room exactly where the defendant said he strangled his son. And so, we have charged the defendant with first-degree murder. For this charge, we must prove two things. First, the defendant killed Nathan. And second, that killing was planned, heartless, or done without care to Nathan's life. Since we're bringing these charges today, we have the burden of proof, and we have to prove them beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean beyond all doubt, just a reasonable doubt. But the defense also has a burden today because the defendant is pleading insanity. The defense must prove by clear and convincing evidence that the defendant either didn't know right from wrong or didn't know what he was doing when he killed Nathan. And you see, it's not just any mental illness the defendant claims to have. It's schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a serious and debilitating mental illness that can trick the mind and make it think that something's not there. Now, you may want to believe or even hope that the defendant has schizophrenia because no reasonable, right-in-the-head loving parent could do this to their own child. Just remember, killing your son is always senseless. But that doesn't mean the killer is. It was a senseless crime, but not a senseless man. And luckily, in this case, we have an expert witness to help you understand what schizophrenia is and why we know the defendant doesn't have it. Here's what the expert will say. You'll learn that after looking over all of the information, over 100 pages worth, that Dr. McLaGreca, who has practiced psychiatry for nearly 3 decades, came to the conclusion that the defendant was malingering. You'll learn that malingering is a big word with a really simple meaning. Faking. It means faking. In fact, the facts will show the defendant was pulled over at a routine DUI stop. He spoke with the police, looked them in the eye, and answered their questions. But the moment the police shine a flashlight in the back seat, the moment they see shovels, bleach, and large garbage bags, the moment he was caught, that's the moment the defendant suddenly had schizophrenia symptoms and confessed. And the evidence will show there's no real history of schizophrenia either. The defendant had never told a doctor about it before. The defendant had never been hospitalized with it before. The defendant had never been diagnosed with it before. Fight, flight, or fake it. The defendant chose fake it. It was a senseless crime, but not a senseless man. The facts say so, and the expert says so. And at the end of this trial, my co-counsel will ask you to return the only just verdict. A verdict that holds the defendant responsible no matter how hard he tries to squirm out of it. A verdict of guilty.
Thank you very much. Defense, are you prepared to give your opening?
Yes, whenever the court is ready for me to proceed.
I'm ready.
From the time Timothy Ray was born, he has been a ticking time bomb. A long fuse lit by an undiagnosed mental illness and the combination of an abusive mom, a lonely life, an unfaithful wife, and voices screaming at him from his own head. That is who Timothy Ray is. Timothy Ray was supposed to be okay, but the signs of Timothy's illness, they were always there. Timothy thought that he had to suppress his illness, hide his demons, silence those voices, but the longer he did this, the stronger the illness got. And unfortunately, on the morning of October 17th, 2018, these voices became deafening, and this ticking time bomb exploded. No one here today is denying that what happened to Nathan Ray is a tragedy that took the life of a 6-year-old boy. But members of the jury, this tragedy is the result of an illness that has tormented Timothy Ray for decades. Today, we are not here to dispute what happened, but we are here to dispute why. Why Timothy Ray took his own son's life. Now, this is a little different than a normal criminal case because we have entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Regardless of that plea, this is still a criminal case, and there is one thing that is true about this case and all other criminal cases. That is that the state bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt Timothy Ray's guilt. The law in West Carolina is that the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Timothy Ray is guilty before you ever consider our plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Think about it this way. Just like you cannot turn the ignition in your car until you put in your key, you cannot consider our plea of not guilty by reason of insanity if the state fails to meet their burden today. The state will not meet that burden today, but we will meet ours. Today, we will prove that at the time of Nathan Ray's death, Timothy Ray suffered from schizophrenia, and that it was the schizophrenia that caused Timothy Ray to take his own son's life. Now, let's start at the beginning. In 1986, Timothy Ray is born. He is born to a mom that is suffering from an invisible illness. Timothy is born to a mom that refuses to feed him, a mom that puts him in cold baths, a mom that acts like Timothy does not exist. When Timothy is just 3 years old, his mom leaves. Shortly after she leaves, she's placed into a mental institution. Tick, tick, tick. Fast forward to 1996. Timothy Ray is 10 years old. This is a lonely time in Timothy's life. His mom is gone, and his dad is always busy working at the steel mill in Skelton. One day, Timothy's home alone. The house is quiet. Suddenly, Timothy hears a voice. He looks around, but no one's there. Timothy knows something is wrong, but he cannot tell anyone. He cannot be labeled mentally ill like his mom. So he suppresses his illness, hides his demons, and tries to silence those voices. Tick, tick, tick. It's 2010. Timothy Ray is in the Army. Timothy is serving under Officer Cruz. And it's not long before Officer Cruz begins to realize that something's not right with Timothy. Officer Cruz goes to Dr. Shane Riley, a psychiatrist at Walter Reed. Officer Cruz tells Dr. Riley that Timothy is seeing things, he's sleepwalking, and that he's suicidal. Dr. Riley calls Timothy in for a 3-day psychiatric evaluation. Going into this evaluation, Timothy knows that he cannot be labeled mentally ill like his mom. So he does what he has always done. He suppresses his illness, hides his demons, and silences those voices. Timothy tells Dr. Riley that he's anxious, he's depressed, and that he's having trouble sleeping. Dr. Riley diagnoses Timothy with general anxiety and discharges Timothy from the military. After leaving the military, Timothy is seen by his primary care physician, Dr. DiGiuseppe, 3 times over a 6-year period. During the first visit with Dr. DiGiuseppe, Timothy reports the same things that he did to Dr. Riley back in 2010, that he's anxious, that he's having trouble sleeping, and that he is depressed. The next visit in 2014, Timothy begins to unravel. During this appointment, Timothy loses control of his emotions and begins crying uncontrolled. The last visit with Dr. DiGiuseppe was sometime between 2016 and 2017. This visit is chaotic, and Timothy Ray is not okay. Dr. DiGiuseppe even asks, "Timothy, are you okay?" Timothy looks at Dr. DiGiuseppe and says, "No, I have never been okay." Then Timothy loses control of his emotions. He begins to scream at Dr. DiGiuseppe and starts crying uncontrollably. Dr. DiGiuseppe tries to calm Timothy down, and finally she succeeds. But this is serious. She knows Timothy needs help. So she sets him up an appointment with a mental health professional the next day. Tick, tick, tick. It's 2018. Timothy is married but separated from his wife after she's had an affair. Timothy has their son Nathan Ray at his house for a couple of days, but these two are not alone. The voices are back and they are louder than ever before. Nathan spills his juice on Timothy's laptop and the voices begin to scream. He did it on purpose, tick. He's trying to sabotage you, tick. Punish him, tick. Timothy's body is in the house, but he is no longer there. Timothy tries to regain control, but the voices continue to yell. Kill him. Strangle him. Make him understand. Tick, tick, tick. Boom. Finally, this ticking time bomb explodes, and Timothy Ray takes his own son's life. After Timothy takes his son's life, he doesn't know what to do. So he takes Nathan's body to Brandywine State Park and buries it. On Timothy's way back to Skelton, he stopped at a DUI checkpoint by Officer Wentz. Today, you will have the opportunity to hear from Officer Wentz. Officer Wentz will tell you that when she immediately got to Timothy Ray's car, she knew something was not right with this guy. Officer Wentz will tell you that when she asked Timothy Ray to get out of the car, he looked at her and asked if she was in the CIA. Officer Wentz will tell you that throughout this entire interaction, Timothy was a mess, that he was acting so crazy she had to restrain him. Officer Wentz will tell you that she even thought an EMT needed to be called to the scene to treat Timothy. Today, you will hear from Dr. Shane Riley, a forensic psychiatrist and the first doctor to treat Timothy back in 2010. Today, we have brought Dr. Riley in to explain just how deep Timothy's illness runs, just how much and how long Timothy Ray has suffered. Today, Dr. Riley will tell you what he learned from Jessica Ray, Timothy Ray's ex-wife, how Timothy suffered from mood swings their entire marriage, how Timothy would go weeks without showering, how Timothy would lock himself in their bathroom and cry uncontrollably for hours, how Timothy Ray was never okay. Dr. Riley will tell you what he learned from Detective Booth, the lead investigator in this case and the detective that interviewed Timothy Ray. Dr. Riley will tell you that Detective Booth knew Timothy Ray well before this case ever began, and that Detective Booth did not preserve key pieces of evidence that we need today in this trial. At the end of Dr. Riley's testimony, he will tell you how all of Timothy's symptoms, combined with his mom's mental illness and abuse of Timothy, all came together and created a ticking time bomb. At the end of today's trial, we will come before you and ask that you return the only verdict that the evidence supports and that justice demands. And that is a verdict finding Timothy Ray not guilty of first-degree murder or not guilty by reason of insanity.
Okay, defense, thank you very much. State, you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Detective Booth to the stand. And Your Honor, we just ask that opposing counsel mute their microphone and their video so that we can focus on the witness as well.
Your
I
Honor,
believe the rules, no, hang on, sorry. The rules are gonna be that his video has to stay up, and obviously he needs to be able to be heard for objections, so I'm gonna deny that. Obviously, do not distract the opposing party, and that will be for everybody.
yes, Your Honor.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Detective Booth, and I'm from the Skelton Police Department.
And how long have you worked with the Skelton Police Department?
I've worked for Skelton for a total of 23 years. I started off at the Violence and Narcotics Unit, and later on I became a detective. Up until 3 years, I moved over to homicide.
And how many homicides have you investigated?
I've investigated a total of 12 homicides, and I've been the lead in 4, including this one.
Detective Booth, why are you testifying here today?
I'm here today because I was the lead investigator in the killing of Nathan Ray.
And how did you get involved in this case?
Well, I first got involved because of a missing persons report, which was filed by the victim's mother, Jessica Ray.
Your Honor, I'm getting ready to show this witness what has been admitted as Exhibit 7 on page 54 of the case notebook. Do I have permission to publish?
Yes.
And Detective Booth, do you have that in front of you?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell us what Exhibit 7 is?
That is a missing persons report, which was filed by Jessica Ray.
And why did Jessica Ray file this missing persons report?
Well, as you can see by the narrative in the report, Jessica Ray was separated from her husband, and they were in less than amicable situation. And she hadn't seen her son for 2 days. And the last person that she saw Nathan with was with the defendant, Timothy.
Now, Detective Booth, how did this go from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation?
So like I mentioned before, we had the missing persons report filed, and we put out a BOLO for the defendant, which is a be on the lookout. The defendant got stopped in one of our regular sobriety checkpoints. And when the police officers ran the license plates, the missing persons report came out, and I received a call to go right over to the scene.
What did you do once you'd arrived on scene?
Once I arrived on scene, I was able to take a look at the defendant's car and was able to see some burial tools in the back of the car. And then I was able to talk to the defendant himself.
Your Honor, I'd like to show the witness what has been entered into evidence already as Exhibit 22 on page 99 of the case notebook. Do I have permission to do so?
Yes.
Detective Booth, do you have Exhibit 22 in front of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is actually one of the photos that I took of the defendant's car right after we were able to get a search warrant for it. And it is what I was able to see at the car when I arrived to the scene. Like I mentioned, there were some burial tools in the car, and you can see them in the photograph. It's the shovel, the Clorox bleach bottles, and in the corner you can see a packet of black trash bags.
Now, Detective Booth, you said at the checkpoint you also had a conversation with the defendant. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, ma'am. Once I arrived to the scene, I communicated to the defendant that we would be taking him over to the station, and he expressly said, "I understand. I will tell you everything."
And what did the defendant tell you once you got down to the station?
Once we got down to the station, we began our interview, and that was when the defendant confessed to killing his son with a belt.
Now, Detective Booth, can you walk us through exactly how the defendant described killing Nathan?
Yes, ma'am. He said that it started the morning of October 17th, 2018. Nathan and himself were getting ready for their day, having breakfast. Suddenly, Nathan spilled his juice on the defendant's laptop, and that got the defendant very angry. He began to try to punish Nathan with
Objection, narrative.
Your Honor, if I may,
You may.
Detective Booth is only discussing what the defendant told her happened during the interview. It's not narrative. It is exactly as the defendant said happened at the police station.
Defense.
Your Honor, this is a narrative. She's telling the story of how the defendant took his son's life. This is a narrative.
I will overrule it for now.
Detective Booth, you can continue.
like I said, Nathan spilled juice accidentally on the defendant's laptop, and that got the defendant very upset. He began to try to punish Nathan with a series of different techniques, yelling at him, some physical exercise. Eventually, the defendant got a hold of one of his belts and then used that to hit Nathan and eventually strangle him.
Now, Detective Booth, after the defendant told you that he'd killed Nathan, did he say what he did with the body?
Yes, the defendant said that he buried it in the woods of Brandywine State Park over by 22. We were able to confirm that by sending a team over, and we found Nathan's body there.
Now, once you found Nathan's body, was there ever an autopsy performed?
Yes, ma'am, that is standard procedure. After that, a medical examiner made a report, and I was able to review that.
Your Honor, I would like to publish what has been entered into evidence as Exhibit 6 on page 53 of the case notebook. Do I have permission to do so?
You do.
Sorry about that, Detective Booth. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can you tell us how the medical examiner's report was helpful in your investigation?
Well, as you can see by the second line on the medical examiner's report, he specifically ascribed the manner of death to asphyxiation and determined the cause of death to be homicide. That was especially significant because it was consistent with the defendant's confession of using a belt to strangle his son.
And Detective Booth, did you ever find a weapon that could be used to cause asphyxiation?
Yes, ma'am. We conducted a search of the defendant's home, and when we went over to Nathan's bedroom, we were able to find a belt on the floor. Again, that was consistent with the defendant's confession.
Your Honor, permission to publish what has been entered into evidence as Exhibit 27 on page 104 of the case notebook.
Yes.
Detective Booth, where exactly did you find this belt?
I found this belt in Nathan's bedroom, and it collaborated with the medical examiner's report and the confession.
Now, Detective Booth, at the conclusion of your investigation, were there any other suspects in this crime?
No, ma'am. The body in the woods, exactly where the defendant said it was, the belt, the burial tools in his car, the confession itself in the station, we only had one suspect, and that was Timothy Ray.
Thank you, Detective Booth. I have no further questions for you at this time.
Thank you, State. Defense, do you have any cross?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Yes.
Detective Booth, you've claimed you had some mental health training.
Maybe at the beginning of my training, I received a variety of training. I don't specifically recall. It was a long time ago.
Detective Booth, you previously said you received mental health training 23 years ago at the Police Academy.
I believe I did.
And you cannot remember any of that training.
I mean, like I said, it was 23 years ago. I think the majority of our training we get in the field.
Detective Booth, you met Timothy Ray in August of 2018.
Yes, he.
And you met his son. You met his son, Nathan Ray.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, if the witness can just be permitted to finish her answers.
Yes, I think that was just a technical glitch, but yes, please allow the witness to answer.
Yes, ma'am. I didn't know that she was still talking.
Fine.
Sorry. You met Nathan Ray?
Yes, I did. Our sons played soccer together, so that's how I met him in a soccer practice.
Right, Detective Booth. Your sons played together.
Yes.
And later on, after you met Timothy and Nathan, you were named the lead detective in the Nathan Ray homicide case.
Mhm.
And Timothy Ray was your suspect.
Mhm.
You would agree that you had to conduct a thorough investigation
Yeah.
to follow protocol.
Mhm.
And you've previously said that when conducting an investigation, you have to follow protocol to make sure everything is above the board.
Mhm.
And Skelton Police Department has protocol and directives.
Yes.
And those protocols and directives, they control the evidence.
Yes.
And a part of the evidence under those protocols and directives are interviews with suspects.
Yes, sir.
And those interviews are audio recorded and video recorded.
Yes, sir.
You conducted an audio and video recorded interview of Timothy Ray.
Yes, all of our interviews are recorded.
You had 30 days after this interview was over to request a copy of the audio and video recording.
Yes, well, you see the way that our system works, it just deletes videos automatically if we don't request that it be preserved. And in this case, the evidence was so clear cut, I did not request one.
A week went by, you did not request a copy.
No, like I said, the evidence was set in.
Detective Booth, I'm going to direct you back to my question. You did not request a copy after a week?
No, sir.
2 weeks went by, you did not request a copy.
Objection, Your Honor.
Grounds?
This question has been asked and answered. We've already established that Detective Booth at no time after the 30 days preserved that video.
Your Honor, may I be heard briefly?
You may.
I'm just trying to walk through the time frame and the decision making of this detective and her investigation on her decision to preserve this recording or not.
I will allow a little leeway since it's on cross, but just be careful how far you go.
Yes, Your Honor. 3 weeks went by, you did not request a copy.
No, sir. I did not request a copy. The evidence was clear cut. I didn't see a need to.
A month went by and you did not request a copy.
No, in the whole 30 days, I did not request a copy. Yeah, we already have the transcript.
We'll get to the transcript here in just a second, but you did not request a copy because you knew the defendant was guilty.
All the evidence pointed to that.
And you know that you were called to testify before this jury today.
Yes.
And you know that it is up to this jury to decide whether or not Timothy Ray is guilty.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
But before this jury heard this case and Timothy Ray had his day in court, you decided the defendant was guilty.
Counsel, the evidence pointed to that. So
You decided he was guilty.
I'm not the one who decides, the jury decides, but I think all the evidence pointed to him being guilty.
All right, Detective Booth. And while we may have the transcript that you were just talking about, this jury cannot see how Timothy Ray looked during this audio and video recorded interview.
Well, there was a photo that we took when we took him to the station, so they were able to see how he looked.
Detective Booth, they cannot see him in this interview.
Not in the interview exactly, no.
They cannot hear how he sounded during this audio and video recorded interview.
No, the transcript doesn't show that.
And before you conducted this interview of Timothy Ray, you got him to sign a Miranda waiver.
Yes.
And you believe that he understood everything that was going on.
Of course, I asked him specifically, do you understand? And he said yes. I had
Detective Booth,
no didn't.
when you gave Timothy Ray this Miranda waiver, he asked if you were in the CIA.
He did ask me twice when we were at the station.
He asked you specifically when you gave him the waiver and he signed it.
I believe so.
And after he asked if you were in the CIA and then signed the waiver, you started your interview.
Yes, that is correct.
And you believe that Timothy Ray understood everything that was going on during that interview.
Yes, I asked him if he understood, and he said yes.
Throughout this interview, Timothy Ray asked you 2 more times if you were with the CIA.
He did.
And then you asked him why he killed his son.
Yes, I did.
And he told you that they told him to do it.
He did mention the word they. I didn't think much of it.
He told you that they told him to do it.
Yes, sir. I didn't think much of it.
And he told you that they told him his son was trying to sabotage him.
Yeah, he kept saying the word they all throughout.
Right, Detective Booth. He continually told you that they told him things and you did not follow up on it.
No.
And after Timothy Ray continually told you that they told him to do it and that they told him things, you told Timothy Ray that he would be better off dead.
Yes, counsel, I did say that.
Nothing further.
Okay, redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Detective Booth, you talked a lot about that video on cross-examination. Can you tell us why your decision was to not preserve that video?
Yes, ma'am. Like I said, all of the evidence pointed to the defendant being the only suspect in this case. The defendant confessed himself to everything. All of the evidence that we were able to find in the car, in his home, was consistent with that story. The medical examiner's report. And since we had a transcript, I did not request for the video to be preserved.
Thank you, Detective Booth. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness. We just ask that Detective Booth be excused.
Okay. You are constructively excused. State, call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Dr. McLagreca.
And if before we start, if I can get Miss Earhart to please mute her video, then we should be good to go. All right, whenever you're ready.
Dr. LaGreca, it's good to see you.
Hello.
Could you tell us why you're here today?
I'm here as a medical expert in forensic psychiatry.
Objection, Your Honor.
Grounds?
This witness has not been tendered as an expert yet.
State.
Your Honor, if given the opportunity, the witness will rephrase.
Sure.
I'm here to talk about Mr. Ray, the defendant.
Let's talk a little bit about your qualifications, Dr. LaGreca. What's your job right now?
I am a forensic psychiatrist.
And before we get into what an average day looks like for you, what is forensic psychiatry?
A forensic psychiatry is basically the mix between psychiatry and the law.
So what does an average day look like for you today?
Usually I'm helping teach other psychiatrists become forensic psychiatrists at a university hospital. In the meantime, also, I help serve as medical witnesses, medical experts on other cases.
All right, and where did you go to medical school?
I went to medical school in University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
And after graduating from there, did you do any additional training?
Yes, I got board certified in general psychiatry from the University of Los Angeles. After which I went back to University of Pennsylvania for a fellowship, for which I got board certified again back at my alma mater in University of Pennsylvania.
What does that mean to be board certified?
Board certification just basically says that it's basically degrees and a test that I took certifying that I am knowledgeable and an expert in that field of study.
How long have you been practicing as a forensic psychiatrist?
It's been about 30 years now.
And during those 30 years, what kinds of illnesses have you treated?
Broad range, malingering, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, all kinds of psychiatric illnesses.
So schizophrenia is an issue in today's case. How many times have you treated a patient with schizophrenia?
Oh, it's probably in the hundreds.
And have you ever been an expert witness before?
Yes, approximately 7 times.
Were any of those times criminal cases?
Yes.
And as an expert, have you ever testified about schizophrenia before?
Yeah, I believe 5 of those cases were related to schizophrenia.
Your Honor, at this time, we offer Dr. McLagreca as an expert in forensic psychiatry and the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Defense, any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, so tendered.
All right, Dr. LaGreca, were you able to reach any conclusions in this case?
Yeah, I have.
And do you hold these conclusions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Absolutely.
What are your conclusions?
My conclusion is that the defendant was not suffering from schizophrenia, but in fact is malingering.
What is schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is, as defined by the DSM-5, is psychiatric illness where a person tends to lose their sense of reality, usually through delusions, hallucinations, and other negative symptoms.
And what is malingering?
Malingering, I guess the most basic way to explain it is that a patient or anyone essentially is lying about any medical diseases or symptoms that they're trying to pawn off as real just so that they can get something out of it. Usually that be financial, to try to get out of work, or in this case, to get out of jail.
You mentioned the DSM-5.
Yes.
What is the DSM?
The DSM-5, we're in the 5th generation of the DSM-5, but essentially it is the gold standard for psychiatric illnesses and the definitions for which all psychiatrists use to, govern their practice.
How did you use the DSM in this case?
I reviewed the DSM-5 for the definitions of malingering and schizophrenia, and after doing a thorough investigation of the reportings and the records, I reached the conclusion that the patient was in fact malingering and not schizophrenic.
Your Honor, at this time, we seek permission to republish what has been entered as Exhibit 17B.
You may.
Thank you. Dr. LaGreca, could you please read the top paragraph of the DSM-5 definition for malingering?
Sure. Malingering is the stimulation of a disease characterized by the intentional production of falsely or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms motivated by external incentives. Examples of such incentives include avoiding military duty, avoiding work, obtaining financial compensation, evading criminal prosecution, or obtaining drugs.
So which of those motivations applies in this case?
I think it's pretty obvious that in this case, it would be to avoid criminal prosecution.
What other materials did you review?
I looked at the records of both Officer Wentz and the detective, as well as Dr. Riley's interview of the defendant.
Why didn't you interview the defendant?
I had asked to, but I was not given the opportunity.
And why didn't you interview anyone else in this case?
I thought after reading all the documents that I was given access to, I thought I could reach a pretty reasonable conclusion that the defendant was in fact malingering and did not have schizophrenia.
So you mentioned you reviewed Dr. Riley's report. What symptoms of schizophrenia did Dr. Riley claim were present?
She mentioned that the patient was having delusions, hallucinations, and some kind of negative symptoms. But honestly, while I understand where she's coming from, there's a bunch of other reasons why the defendant could be having those signs and symptoms. It's not necessarily there's other reasons for why the defendant could be having those reasons, not just schizophrenia.
Was the defendant ever diagnosed previously with something that could cause those symptoms?
No, he was never diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Was he diagnosed with something else?
He was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder by Dr. Riley himself back in 2010, but never schizophrenia, nor was he ever treated for schizophrenia.
All right, I'd like to talk about the defendant's behavior during the killing of Nathan Ray. What did the defendant tell Dr. Riley he did in his bedroom before?
He said he sat down and he thought for a second or a minute. And I don't know that.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please finish, doctor.
I thought that was kind of interesting that he had the wherewithal and the knowledge of sitting there and I imagine he was rationalizing his decisions and what he wanted to do moving forward.
And how did the defendant trying to calm down affect your diagnosis?
I thought it was instrumental in reaching my conclusion. The fact that he had the wherewithal to even think about what he was going to do next suggested that he had the intention and he had the knowledge that he was going to commit a crime.
And which of your diagnoses did that support?
That supported diagnosis of malingering.
Let's turn to the defendant's behavior when he was stopped by the police. Are you familiar with Officer Wentz's statement?
Yes.
And when did the defendant begin showing symptoms of schizophrenia, according to Officer Wentz?
Absolutely. So according to Officer Wentz's testimony, prior to, I guess the best way I can describe it is, Officer Wentz did not describe the defendant acting suspicious at all until he found incriminating evidence in the back of his car. It was only after this point where the defendant started showing signs of schizophrenia. This switch from absolutely no symptoms of schizophrenia, completely normal, no irrational behavior or activities, to like a flip from that to completely having all these signs and symptoms doesn't really make sense in the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a very chronic disease. We're talking years, months. We're not talking minutes or hours.
Right. Thank you. So let's turn to the defendant's medical history. Are you familiar with the defendant's medical record?
Yes.
And what did the defendant's... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, he was never diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was only diagnosed with general anxiety disorder and nothing else.
And how did the lack of those things impact your conclusion?
Well, for him to have, like the defense is trying to argue that he was having such severe schizophrenia, he probably would have had shown signs and symptoms earlier, and someone would have probably picked it up and treated him for schizophrenia. And this is not the case. He has had no diagnosis of schizophrenia in his years of apparently living with it, and he has never been treated for it. He's only been treated for general anxiety disorder with Paxil, which does not treat schizophrenia at all.
So let me ask you this then. How consistent are all of these facts with schizophrenia?
They're not consistent at all. To be honest, they're much more consistent with him trying to cover up the fact that he killed his own son, and that by definition is malingering.
Nothing further for this witness at the time.
Okay, any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Thank you. Dr. LaGreca, you said something on direct, and I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said that Timothy Ray is faking all of his symptoms?
That's my opinion, yes, that he is in fact not schizophrenic and using that as a cover.
You think he's doing this to avoid prosecution?
Yes.
Well, Dr. LaGreca, let's talk about yourself for a little bit before we get to that. You're being paid by the state to testify today.
As is customary.
You've been paid $12,500 to review all of the materials in this case.
Yes.
So that you could form your opinion.
My expert medical opinion, yes.
An expert medical opinion that you're being paid $1,750 to give here today.
I imagine you're paying your witness too.
That's not the question. My question is, you're being paid $1,750 to testify here today?
Yeah, I think I've earned that from my years of expertise.
An opinion that at the time of Nathan Ray's death, Timothy Ray did not suffer from schizophrenia.
Yes.
Dr. LaGreca, let's talk about schizophrenia.
Absolutely.
Psychiatrists have to rely on a patient's symptoms and associated features to diagnose schizophrenia.
Typically, yes.
There's not a laboratory test that psychiatrists and doctors can use to diagnose schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Meaning you can't draw someone's blood and run a test and say, this guy's got schizophrenia.
Not yet.
So let's talk about some of the symptoms and associated features that psychiatrists look at. Symptoms of schizophrenia include delusions.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Hallucinations.
Yes.
An impaired ability to manage emotions.
Yes.
and changes in your sleep pattern.
I would say that is associated but not integral to the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Well, let's talk about some of those associated features. Associated features of schizophrenia include anxiety.
Well, yes, anxiety is associated with schizophrenia, but anxiety is also associated with a lot of other things like hypertension or, just high stress working environments. It's
It's also associated with schizophrenia.
Yeah, among hundreds of other diseases. Schizophrenia
as
is
well
one.
as depression.
As well as depression, yes.
Your
As
Honor,
well as the lack of personal
you're allowed
hygiene.
to finish.
Hang on, I think there's an objection. Was there an objection?
Yes, Your Honor. We're just asking that the witness be allowed to finish his answer.
Okay. As before, yes, please allow the witness to finish before asking the next question.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm going to ask my question again, Dr. LaGreca. A lack of personal hygiene would be an associated feature of schizophrenia?
Yes.
You would agree with me that without treatment, all of these symptoms and associated features get worse.
Yeah, but I would, like I mentioned before, some medical professional would have picked up on these symptoms long before long before it got this bad.
Let's talk about how you would pick up on some of these symptoms. There are contributing factors to schizophrenia.
There are some, yes, factors.
Contributing factors of schizophrenia include genetics.
Yes.
As well as childhood trauma.
Yes.
Dr. LaGreca, you would agree with me that family history of a mental illness places someone at an increased risk to also suffer a mental illness.
Yes, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily a causation. I would say it's much more of an association. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that just because you have a family member that has schizophrenia, it doesn't mean you will have it too. It's just a slightly more increased chance.
Dr. LaGreca, I'm going to address you back to my question because I did not ask about schizophrenia there. I asked if a family history of a mental illness places someone at an increased risk to also suffer a mental illness.
Yes, any mental illness, any family mental history is usually associated with you yourself having mental illness.
A mental illness like schizophrenia.
Yes, that is one option.
Dr. LaGreca, you would agree with me that childhood trauma places someone at an increased risk to also suffer from a mental illness.
Yes, it's associated with a wide variety of mental illnesses, including general anxiety disorder.
As well as schizophrenia.
Yes.
Now, Dr. LaGreca, in 2009, Timothy had joined the military.
Yeah.
By 2010, Timothy had been admitted to the adult inpatient psychiatric department at Walter Reed.
Absolutely.
There, he was examined by Dr. Shane Riley.
Mm-hmm.
During this examination, Timothy Ray told Dr. Riley that he suffered from anxiety.
Okay.
Is that a yes?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Depression?
Yes.
And trouble sleeping?
Yes.
Dr. Riley diagnosed Timothy with general anxiety disorder.
That would be an accurate assessment of that.
That's a yes?
Yes.
And Dr. Riley discharged Timothy from the military?
Yes.
After being discharged from the military, Timothy was seen by his primary care physician, Dr. DiGiuseppe.
Yes.
Timothy had only 3 appointments over a 6-year period.
That's not that rare.
I wasn't asking whether or not it was rare. I'm simply just asking that he had only 3 appointments with his primary care doctor over a 6-year period.
Yeah, I'm saying that's not rare that it's only 3. That's whatever. Yeah.
During this first visit, Timothy reported the same symptoms that he did to Dr. Riley back in 2010.
The same symptoms of what?
Anxiety.
Okay. Yes.
Is that a yes?
Yes. Yes.
Depression.
Yeah.
And trouble sleeping.
Yes, which are all consistent with the diagnosis of general anxiety disorder that Dr. Riley made in 2010.
And can also be associated features of schizophrenia.
Well, I think you're missing the big picture of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, by definition, by definition, is having one of the symptoms. One of the major symptoms of schizophrenia is delusions or hallucinations. Those weren't really
Dr.
Those are
LaGreca, I
the
hate to cut you off,
primary
but I'm going to
components of.
direct you back to my question because I did not ask about symptoms. I simply asked if those were associated features of schizophrenia.
They are associated, but not critical for the diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Timothy's second appointment with Dr. DiGiuseppe was in 2014.
Yes.
Timothy's ex-wife, Jessica Ray, made him go to this appointment.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Because Timothy would lock himself in the bathroom for hours
Yes.
and cry uncontrollably.
Yes.
During this appointment, Timothy actually lost control of his emotions.
Which is also consistent with general anxiety disorder.
Is that a yes, Dr. LaGreca?
Yes.
The last appointment that Timothy had with Dr. DiGiuseppe was in sometime between 2016 and 2017.
Okay. Yes.
Timothy lacked personal hygiene during this appointment.
Yes.
Timothy started to scream at Dr. DiGiuseppe,
Yes.
told Dr. DiGiuseppe that he had never been okay.
Yes.
Asked Dr. DiGiuseppe if she had been listening to his phone calls.
Yes.
Timothy went to a clinical interview with Dr. Shane Riley in 2019.
Yes.
During this interview with Dr. Riley, Timothy reported that he began hearing voices at the age of 10 years old.
That's what he reported. Yes.
Timothy told Dr. Riley that he had never told anyone about these voices.
Okay. Yes.
Timothy told Dr. Riley that he had never sought treatment for these voices
Yes.
because he did not want to be labeled mentally ill like his mom.
I don't know why he wouldn't want to share those. We could have helped him if he was actually having those symptoms from back then.
Dr. LaGreca, Timothy Ray told Dr. Shane Riley in this interview that he did not tell anyone and he never sought treatment for the voices in his head because he did not want to be labeled mentally ill like his mom.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to hear that. But yes, I believe that is true.
Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
Okay. Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Whenever you're ready.
Dr. LaGreca, the defense mentioned lack of hygiene, sleep disruptions, antisocial behavior. What causes can those have?
I think if you look at his medical history and you look at the symptoms he was mentioning, like the opposing counsel was talking about, like lack of sleep, these mood swings, this lack of hygiene. Those are, while they are associated with schizophrenia, like the opposing counsel is trying to show, they're also associated with general anxiety disorder, which is this patient, which the defendant is diagnosed with. And they're much more pressing signs of general anxiety disorder. As you can imagine, if someone was extremely anxious, they could be nervous, they could be angry, they could have poor emotion control. Sometimes nervousness and anxiety is such an elevated state that they might not shower because they're too anxious to do anything, to get out of bed, to brush their teeth, any of the reasons. So honestly, the symptoms that he's been showing, demonstrating the defendant, are much more consistent with Dr. Riley's original and only diagnosis of general anxiety disorder.
Thank you. Nothing further for this witness. We ask that Dr. LaGreca be excused and thanked.
Okay, you are excused. Thank you, doctor. State, call your next witness.
We have no more witnesses, Your Honor.
So are you resting?
Yes, the defense rests, or excuse me, the government rests.
Thank you. Defense, are you ready to proceed with your case?
Yes, Your Honor, but before we proceed, the defense would like to raise a Rule 29 motion for judgment of acquittal. When viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the non-moving party, which in this case is the state, no reasonable juror could conclude that Timothy Ray had the requisite mental intent to kill his son on October 17, 2018. Today you heard from the state's own expert, and you heard that Timothy Ray suffered a litany of schizophrenia symptoms and associated features in the time leading up to the killing and the time of the killing, which goes to show that Timothy Ray did not have the intent and was not able to form the intent on the day that he killed his son. You also heard from Detective Booth, who said that Timothy Ray was showing symptoms, asking who they, like telling him that they told him to do things, and was listening to voices, which goes to show that at that time he was still under a schizophrenic episode and was unable to form the requisite mental intent.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. Viewing the facts in the light most favorable to the non-moving party, in this case the state, a reasonable jury could find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. With respect to the lack of malice aforethought or mental state, we have proven that the symptoms that did exist had multiple causes and were not necessarily caused by schizophrenia. Additionally, the symptoms that were displayed were more likely caused by malingering. And lastly, that the method of death here was strangulation. And strangulation is a deliberate and slow act, and therefore the requisite intent could be developed during that act.
Any further argument from defense?
Yes, Your Honor. As I just said, Timothy Ray had symptoms consistent with schizophrenia. While they may be consistent with other illnesses, they were consistent with schizophrenia on the day that he killed his son, which goes to show that he could not form the required mental intent to kill his son.
All right, I am going to deny the motion. I'm going to find that Dr. LaGreca testified that he believed that this was malingering, that there was no mental illness to the point that it would impair the defendant's ability to know the difference between right and wrong, and so it will become a question for the jury. Are we ready to proceed with defense's case? Does anybody, including jurors, need a break before we continue going?
Defense would request a 5-minute recess.
All right, then we'll take 5 minutes. Are we all back and ready?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we would request a time check before moving forward.
Okay, so you are aware the rules are that you are meant to keep your own time. There is
Yes, Your
no
Honor.
bailiff. However, I have been keeping track. So what I can tell you is that defense, you have used 24 minutes and 36 seconds, and state you have used 27 minutes and 14 seconds. I apologize, I don't have the math for how long that means you have left.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Do we have all the witnesses that we need?
Yes, Your Honor, I believe so.
All right, then whenever you're ready, defense, you may call your first witness.
The defense calls Officer Peyton Wentz to the stand. Whenever the court's ready for us to proceed.
I'm ready.
Will you please introduce yourself to us?
My name's Officer Peyton Wentz.
Officer Wentz, why are you here today?
I was the arresting officer at the DUI checkpoint on October 19th, 2018.
And before we get to that night, I'd like to get to know you a little bit better. Where are you a police officer at?
I work for the Skelton Police Department.
What all did you have to complete to become a police officer?
Well, after graduating with my bachelor's degree, I went to the police academy where I was trained on a variety of things and took an additional course focusing on mental health and suspects.
What did you learn in this additional course on handling situations involving mentally ill suspects?
I learned a lot of things, including different mental illnesses, how to identify kinds of mental illnesses and potential suspects, and ultimately how to de-escalate situations involving suspects suffering from mental illness.
All right, Officer Wentz, let's talk about the night in question. What time did Timothy Ray come to the DUI checkpoint?
It was around 9 p.m.
What was the first thing you noticed about Timothy Ray?
Well, right away I could tell something was off. His hair was a mess, his eyes were glassy, his clothes were stained, and he smelled as if he'd been in his car for weeks.
Officer Wentz, did it seem like Timothy Ray had been drinking?
No, that was the most interesting part. He didn't appear intoxicated at all.
Officer Wentz, what was the first thing you asked Timothy to do?
Well, I asked him for his license and registration as we were at a DUI checkpoint.
Did he give you his license and registration?
Not at first. He didn't hand me those until I pointed out to him that I could see his wallet sitting on his passenger seat.
What did you do after Timothy gave you his license and registration?
Well, I went to go run his information back at my patrol car, but on my way back, I looked inside of his back seat and noticed the mess.
What kind of mess did you notice?
Well, there was trash everywhere, and then I noticed the shovel, the trash bags, and the 2-gallon jugs of bleach sitting on top of the toddler booster seat.
After seeing all this in the back of Timothy's car, what did you do?
Well, at this point, I became nervous that Mr. Ray might try to drive off. So I had my partner run his information and walk back up to his window.
What did you do when you got back to Timothy's car?
Well, that's when things got kind of weird. Mr. Ray began to ask me if I was in the CIA, begging me to give him my CIA credentials.
Officer Wentz, are you in the CIA?
No, and no matter how many times I tried to tell him that I was just a Skelton Police Department officer, he just didn't quite understand.
What happened after this?
Well, it was at that point that I asked him to step out of his vehicle.
What happened when Timothy Ray got out of his car?
Well, he kind of like flipped a switch. When he was in his car, he was frantic and convinced that he was wanted by the CIA for being a terrorist. But when he got out of his car, he kind of became a zombie and then started doing jumping jacks on the side of the road.
Did Timothy Ray ever stop doing jumping jacks?
It wasn't until I actually had to pull my gun on him.
What did Timothy Ray do when you pulled your gun on him?
Well, at that point, he sat down and covered his ears with his hands and began to sob.
What did you do about this?
Well, that is when I decided that I needed to restrain him.
Officer Wentz, at the time you restrained him, was Timothy under arrest?
No, I just had to cuff him because I couldn't control him.
What happened after Timothy was placed in cuffs?
Well, it was at that point that my partner walked up and informed me that he was linked to a missing persons case. So based on his behavior in that report, I called in to dispatch.
What happened when you called in to dispatch?
I informed dispatch that we had a person in custody linked to a missing persons case who was acting strange.
What happened after you made this phone call?
Well, to be quite honest, I was expecting an EMT based on what I reported to dispatch, but all we got was Detective Booth.
What did Detective Booth do when he arrived on scene?
He asked me what had happened and then placed Mr. Ray under arrest and requested that I drive him down to the station.
How did Timothy Ray act on the way to the police station?
Well, he sat in the back seat and sobbed, like he sobbed the whole way there.
During this car ride to the police station, did you ever try and calm Timothy down?
No, based on my mental health training, once you get a suspect somewhat in control, it's best to leave them alone and keep them from going back into another episode.
Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness at this time.
Okay, any cross state?
Yes, Your Honor.
Whenever you're ready.
Officer Wentz, help me out with this timeline. You stopped the defendant's car as part of a DUI checkpoint.
Yes, I was on duty that night.
You went up to the driver's window.
I did, as protocol.
You asked for the defendant's license and registration.
Yes, that's what you do at a DUI checkpoint.
And he asked why you needed it.
He did.
So you explained to him it's a routine traffic stop.
Yes, that's exactly what we were there for.
And he tells you he left his license at home.
He did say that.
And he told you he doesn't keep his registration in the car.
Yeah, that's what he told me. Yes, sir.
But you see the defendant's wallet in between the seats.
I could see it, yes.
And like any good cop, you pointed out to him.
Yes, sir, I did.
And after you looked him in the eye, he groaned and gave you his registration too.
Yes, sorry, I can't really hear you. I was able to get both his license and his registration.
He hasn't asked if you're CIA yet.
No, sir.
He isn't, to use your words, acting like a zombie.
No, not at this point, no.
He isn't waving his arms around.
No, sir, he's still in his vehicle.
He isn't shouting about his dead son.
No, sir, not at this point.
Okay, so after you get the license, you go back to your squad car.
Yes.
But before you did, you shine your flashlight in the back seat.
I did, yes, sir.
While the defendant was still in the car.
Yes, he was still sitting in the driver's side.
You see a shovel.
I did see a shovel.
You see 2 jugs of bleach.
Yes, sir, I did.
You see large garbage bags.
I did see that.
Okay, let's compare the defendant's behavior before you saw those items to after. After you shine your flashlight in the back seat, you walk to your squad car.
I did.
And when you walked back to the defendant, that's when he asks if you're CIA.
Yes.
As you testified on direct, he kind of flipped a switch.
I mean, he just went from going to being kind of frantic to when I asked him to get out of the car, that's when he started acting weirder than he was before.
And when he's out of the car, then he starts doing jumping jacks.
Yes, he was doing jumping jacks on the side of the road.
He starts acting like a zombie.
Yeah, it was more like his facial expressions. I guess you misunderstood. He got a little just kind of confused and like upset.
He puts his hands over his ears while his head rolls around.
Yes.
And you tell Detective Booth that he only asked if you're CIA, began acting like a zombie, started doing jumping jacks and shouting, following you looking into the backseat.
I let Detective Booth know about everything that happened at the DUI checkpoint.
Including the order of events.
Yes.
Nothing further for this witness.
Okay, any redirect?
Your Honor, the defense has no redirect. May this witness be excused?
They may. Defense, call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Shane Riley. Your Honor, before we begin with this direct examination, we have a demonstrative that we intend to use during this examination that we showed to opposing counsel pre-trial to no objections.
State.
That's correct, Your Honor. No objection.
Okay, and may I please get Mr. Holt, and your name is there? Then never mind, he's gone. Okay, whenever you're ready.
What is your name?
Dr. Shane Riley.
Dr. Riley, why are you here today?
I'm here to give my opinion regarding Timothy Ray's schizophrenia the day he killed his son.
All right, Dr. Riley, before we get there, I just have a couple questions. What do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic psychiatrist.
What degrees did you have to get to become a forensic psychiatrist?
I received my bachelor's in biology and then my medical degree, followed by fellowship and residency in psychiatry.
Okay, Dr. Riley, after you got all those degrees, what kind of jobs did you hold?
I was a forensic psychiatrist in the military. I was also a professor of psychiatry, and now I also hold my own private practice in psychiatry.
Have you ever been published on psychiatry?
Yes, I have.
And have any of those publishings been about schizophrenia?
I've been published 15 times, 2 of which were on schizophrenia.
Have you ever served as an expert witness before?
Yes, I have, 25 times before.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense offers Dr. Shane Riley as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry.
Any objection by the state?
Your Honor, voir dire.
You may.
Your Honor, may I be heard briefly? Before
You
we
may.
begin this voir dire, can we understand that this time does go with the cross-examination for the state?
It does. This goes against the state. And it's constructively outside the presence of the jury.
Your Honor, may I proceed?
You may.
Dr. Riley, you're board certified in psychiatry, correct?
Yes,
And that's in general psychiatry.
yes,
You have a board certification in general psychiatry,
yes,
but not in forensic psychiatry.
no,
So you have not taken the board certification examination for forensic psychiatry.
I received my fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
Dr. Riley, you would agree that there's no substitute for that board certification to include a fellowship.
I don't understand the question.
The only way to get board certified is through an examination, correct?
Yes,
So a fellowship would not satisfy that requirement.
a fellowship in forensic psychiatry is done after a residency in general psychiatry.
Right, but Dr. Riley, that doesn't replace a board certification, correct?
There's no board certification for fellowship. You complete fellowship and you have completed your fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
Understood, Dr. Riley. Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution objects to Dr. Riley being tendered as a forensic psychiatrist. The qualification and the quality control requirement of a board certification in forensic psychiatry is absent here. And for those reasons, this witness should not be permitted to testify as a forensic psychiatrist. The prosecution has no issues with Dr. Riley testifying in his expertise as a psychiatrist, but not with the board certification in forensic psychiatry.
Response.
Your Honor, Dr. Riley has completed a fellowship in forensic psychiatry, and he has worked for over 20 years in the field of forensic psychiatry, including with our U.S. military. He is more than qualified to give an opinion here today as a forensic psychiatrist.
State, other than board certification, is there anything else that does not qualify him as being an expert in forensic psychiatry?
No, Your Honor, and we would just re-raise the point that the board qualification and quality control measure that provides, it really truly hones in on the aspect of forensic psychiatry, which is why he would be testifying today, which is the intersection of the criminal justice system, the legal expertise, and then also psychiatry. Because he hasn't had that board certification, we object to him being able to discuss those things.
I thank you for your argument. I believe that is fodder for cross-examination. I am going to tender him as an expert. So defense, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Riley, were you able to reach an opinion in today's case?
Yes, I was.
Is that opinion based on sufficient facts and data?
Yes,
Is your opinion based on reliable principles and methods?
yes,
Were you able to reliably apply those principles and methods to the facts of this case?
yes, I was.
Is your opinion based to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes,
Dr. Riley, when forming your opinion for this case, what all did you review?
I reviewed all of the material for the case, including my own interviews with Timothy Ray, Abe Ray, Jessica Ray, as well as Timothy Ray's boss at his job. And I also reviewed the DSM-5 criteria.
Did you review any statements by Detective Booth and Officer Wentz?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Riley, a second ago you said the DSM-5. What is the DSM-5?
The DSM-5 is essentially a manual used by psychiatrists to objectively diagnose mental illness.
Does the DSM cover schizophrenia?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I would direct court and counsel to what has been previously admitted as Exhibit 17A. Dr. Riley, under the DSM, in this section specifically on schizophrenia, what are the requirements to go into a schizophrenia diagnosis?
You need to have at least two of the following symptoms: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thought or speech, catatonia or negative symptoms, and at least one has to be in the first three symptoms that I mentioned. In addition, you have to have a significant impairment in functioning, and also these symptoms have to be going on for at least 1 month.
Dr. Riley, this also can't be caused by another mental illness or substance, right?
Yes, it cannot.
Okay. Dr. Riley, I want to break your opinion down now a little bit. In your evaluation of this case, what years did Timothy Ray show symptoms or associated features of schizophrenia?
So in reviewing the facts of the case, he showed signs and symptoms of schizophrenia in the years 1996, 2010, 2011, 2014, 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19.
What year was Timothy Ray born?
He was born in 1986.
Your Honor, at this time, we request permission to publish the demonstrative.
You may.
Okay, Dr. Riley, let's look at this timeline together. Let's talk about 1986. What happened in 1986 that led to your opinion?
So I reviewed his past medical history and past family history as well. As a child, he was severely abused by his primary caregiver, his mother. This included not feeding him and general neglect. In addition, it was also known that his mother suffered from a severe psychiatric illness. Although it was undiagnosed, it was severe enough to institutionalize her. And so these are all risk factors that can contribute to the development of schizophrenia in a patient later on.
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis.
Yes, we move to strike the statement that the severe mental illness was the reason that the defendant's mother was institutionalized. This lacks foundation. There is no evidence or no testimony that will be provided to show that that was the reason or what the cause was of the defendant's mother's institutionalization.
Your Honor, may I be heard briefly?
You may.
Your Honor, Dr. Riley reviewed the testimony of Timothy Ray's father, Mr. Abe Ray. And in that interview, Mr. Ray lays out why Timothy Ray's mother was institutionalized and the fact that it was from severe mood swings. She was put in a mental institution because of severe mood swings, and this expert is more than qualified to testify on that.
Do you have where in his report that is?
Yes, it is on page. It begins on page 62. The interview with Abe Ray begins there and goes to page 63. And you can see on the last two sentences on page 62 that Abe Ray says that she was put in a mental institution for severe mood swings.
State.
Yes, if I may, Your Honor. At the bottom of the report, it says that Abe Ray suspected, which is certainly not enough information to provide a foundation for a mental institutionalization. Additionally, we do not know what institution she was forced to be a part of. We don't know what type of institution it was, and we don't know for how long or if she was even diagnosed with a mental illness.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, this expert in forensic psychiatry took the base of Mr. Abe Ray's interview and applied it to his opinion. This objection by opposing counsel is a question of weight, not admissibility, and the jury should be privileged to hear this, and they are more than welcome to take it up on cross-examination.
I'm going to sustain it in part. I believe that you may get into the fact that the mother was institutionalized, but I don't see in here where it says why she was institutionalized. So if you could
Yes, Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Riley, was Timothy Ray's mother institutionalized?
Yeah, she was.
All right, moving forward to 1996, what symptoms or associated features did Timothy Ray exhibit in 1996?
So in 1996, when he was 10 years old, he first reported that he was having hallucinations and hearing voices.
And how long did Timothy Ray say that he heard voices?
He reported that the voices had been, continuous from that point on and off, and increasing or decreasing in severity, but always there.
Okay, Dr. Riley, moving forward, so Timothy Ray was experiencing these voices throughout his life. Let's talk about 2010. What symptoms or associated features did Timothy Ray exhibit in 2010?
So in 2010, when I examined him at Walter Reed, he was exhibiting signs of severe stress, anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, and he was also having suicidal ideations.
Okay, Dr. Riley, when you treated him in 2010, were you able to make a diagnosis?
Yes, I was. At that time, based on what he was reporting, I did diagnose him with generalized anxiety disorder.
All right, Dr. Riley, moving forward from the anxiety, depression, and trouble sleeping in 2010, what did you learn about 2011?
So in 2011, he was interviewed by his primary care physician, Dr. DiGiuseppe, and at this time he reported anxiety, depression, severe stress, difficulty sleeping, similar to before.
And are those all symptoms and associated features of schizophrenia?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Riley, let's move forward again to 2014. What symptoms or associated features did Timothy Ray exhibit in 2014?
So in 2014, he also met with his primary care physician, and he reported the same symptoms, anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping. And it was a little notable that at this interview, he began hysterically crying.
Do you know why Timothy went to Dr. DiGiuseppe?
He went because, his wife mentioned that he needed some help and maybe see a doctor because of his severe mood swings and just abnormal behavior.
So after Timothy's hysterical crying and mood swings, let's move forward to 2015. What symptoms and associated features did you learn that Timothy Ray exhibited in 2015?
In 2015, he was exhibiting a lot of paranoia, paranoid delusions in specific. He mentioned or reported that he thought his wife and his child were going to cut him up with a knife. And all of these were in context with the ongoing depression and anxiety that he had.
Okay, Dr. Riley. After Timothy began showing signs of paranoia about his wife and son, let's look forward to 2016 and 2017. What did you learn about 2016 and 17?
So this was his third visit with Dr. DiGiuseppe, and it was notable because his symptoms had, significantly intensified. He had the hallucinations, the anxiety, depression, lack of sleep. But what was significant was that all of these were displayed at the meeting with his primary care physician. He was emotionally labile, he was combative, aggressive, and he was also paranoid that Dr. DiGiuseppe was listening on his phone calls. So when he was asked if he was okay, he said to Dr. DiGiuseppe he was never okay in his life.
Okay, Dr. Riley. In 2017, did you learn about any other symptoms Timothy Ray exhibited?
Yeah, he was also mentioning some, in addition to the voices, so auditory hallucinations, he was mentioning visual hallucinations, so just seeing triangles on the walls and things like that. And in addition to everything I mentioned before, all of his other symptoms.
Did Dr. DiGiuseppe make any comments about his appearance at the visit?
Yes, she did. She commented on his lack of hygiene and grooming and just poor hygiene in general.
Okay, Dr. Riley, after this list of symptoms and associated features Timothy suffered from in 2016 and 17, I want to talk to you about 2018. But before we get to the day that Timothy took his son's life, what symptoms or associated features did Timothy report in early 2018?
So in early 2018, he had, reported mood swings, inability to control his emotions, and he showed just aggression, combativeness, and just overall lack of hygiene as well. That was reported.
Okay. Now, did Detective Booth say anything about Timothy Ray before the day that he killed his son?
Objection, Your Honor.
Yeah.
Basis.
Just going to call for hearsay.
Repeat your question.
I asked if during his evaluation he found that Detective Booth said anything about Timothy Ray's symptoms or associated features before he killed his son.
So response to hearsay?
Your Honor, this is a statement made for a medical diagnosis. This went into Dr. Riley's opinion, informing his diagnosis that Timothy Ray suffers from schizophrenia. And for that reason, this is an exception to hearsay.
Any response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. This wasn't a statement made to a medical care provider for the purposes of a diagnosis. This was made for purposes other than that.
I'll overrule it.
What did Detective Booth say about Timothy Ray's symptoms in 2018 before he killed his son?
He mentioned that, in the time that he's known the defendant, he was generally socially inept, unable to sort of sustain a conversation, and then also showed a lack of hygiene that was, not normal.
All right, Dr. Riley, now I want to talk to you about the day that Timothy Ray took his son's life. What symptoms or associated features was Timothy Ray suffering from on October 17th, 2018?
He was suffering from hallucinations, both auditory and visual. He was suffering from severe paranoia and delusions. And overall, he was suffering from negative symptoms as well, such as lack of hygiene and grooming and severe mood swings.
You said that he was having auditory hallucinations. Did he tell you what the voices said?
So at the time, do you mean at the time when he killed his son?
Yes, Dr. Riley.
At that time, he mentioned that he heard the voices, and they were commanding him to punish his son, to make him understand things like that. So in essence, to kill his son.
Okay, Dr. Riley. During your interview with Jessica Ray, did she tell you any other symptoms or associated features that Timothy suffered?
Yeah, she did mention that Timothy Ray was, exhibiting severe mood swings. He would, go weeks without showering or days without showering. He would lock himself in the bathroom and not talk to anyone and things like that.
Taking all of these symptoms and associated features and lining them up with the DSM, what is your opinion here today?
My opinion is that Timothy Ray suffered from schizophrenia most of his life, and that he suffered from uncontrollable schizophrenia, the day he killed his son.
No more questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Thank you. Dr. Riley, you're board certified in general psychiatry, correct?
Yes.
You do not have a board certification in forensic psychiatry.
I completed a fellowship in forensic psychiatry.
So that's a no, you do not have a board certification in forensic psychiatry.
Completing means that you receive all the necessary certifications.
So no, you do not have a board certification in forensic psychiatry.
Once again, completing a residency meets the requirements for that fellowship, or completing the fellowship meets the requirements for that fellowship.
All right, Dr. Riley. Now you've worked on 25 cases before, is that correct?
Yes.
And 22 of those you worked for the defense.
Yes.
22 of those times you provided an opinion for the defense.
Yes.
And in this case, you were hired to evaluate the defendant,
Yes.
to give an opinion as to whether or not the defendant is suffering from schizophrenia.
To give my expert medical opinion.
Now, you would agree that schizophrenia is a progressive disease.
Yes.
And so in order to make an evaluation, you would need to observe the defendant over time.
I would need to observe his medical history and all the medical documents over time, yes.
Right. And in forming your opinion in this case, you reviewed those documents.
I did.
And you also conducted interviews.
Yes.
You conducted interviews of individuals that were close to the defendant.
Yes.
You interviewed the defendant's father.
Yes.
But the defendant never told his father that the CIA was following him.
Yes.
He never told the defendant's father that he'd heard voices.
No, he did not mention that.
And you also interviewed the defendant's boss, correct?
Yes.
And the defendant's boss, she never heard the defendant talk about the CIA.
Yes, she did not.
And the defendant never complained to her about hearing voices.
No.
You also interviewed the defendant's wife.
Yes.
And the defendant never told her about the CIA.
Not the CIA, not specifically, no.
And he never told her that he heard voices.
No.
Now, in your interview with the defendant's wife, you also learned that she had been having an affair.
Yes.
She'd been having an affair for several months.
Yes.
She was having an affair with the next door neighbor.
Yes.
And she was planning on leaving the defendant.
Yes.
He was upset about that.
Yes.
He told you he didn't want to go on without Jesse.
Yes.
Now, just days before the defendant killed Nathan, the defendant learned that Jesse was going to leave him.
Yes.
Let's turn back to the defendant, Dr. Riley. So this wasn't the first time you'd actually conducted an evaluation of him.
No.
You conducted an evaluation of him in 2010.
Yes.
This was back when he was a soldier in the Army.
Yes.
Back when you were in the Army.
Yes.
And it was your job to make sure that soldiers were fit for duty.
It was my job to perform a psychiatric evaluation.
Sure, to make sure that they could perform their duties.
One of those reasons, yes.
And you wanted to make sure that you gave accurate diagnoses to those soldiers.
Yes.
It was a matter of national security, quite frankly.
My goal was to provide what I thought was the diagnosis at that time.
Right. Now let's talk about your diagnosis of him back then. So in 2010, you were able to do a full psychiatric evaluation of the defendant.
Yes.
You observed him.
Yes.
You interviewed him.
Yes.
In fact, he was in the hospital for 3 days.
Yes.
And at the end of that observation period, you diagnosed him with a general anxiety disorder.
That was my working diagnosis at the time.
Now, Dr. Riley, you just said on direct that the defendants had symptoms of schizophrenia since 1996. Is that right?
Yes.
But 14 years later, you diagnosed him with general anxiety disorder.
I can only go off what the patient reports at that time. And at that time, when I interviewed him in 2010, he did not report anything other than what I had said previously. So, at that time, my working diagnosis was generalized anxiety disorder.
Now, Dr. Riley, you didn't diagnose him with schizophrenia in 2010.
Like I said, that was not the diagnosis at the time. My working diagnosis was generalized anxiety disorder. Did not mean that I did not consider schizophrenia and other diagnoses. They were just not, prioritized at that time.
So, Dr. Riley, we would agree you didn't diagnose him with schizophrenia in 2010.
No.
And you didn't refer him to a specialist after that evaluation.
No, I treated him myself.
You didn't prescribe any medication that would treat schizophrenia at that point.
No.
And in fact, Dr. Riley, until you evaluated him a second time, the defendant had never been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
No. But he had never also seen another psychiatrist.
That's right, because Dr. De Giuseppe, who you spoke about on direct examination, she's not a psychiatrist.
Yes, she isn't.
All right, Dr. Riley, I want to move on to malingering. You're familiar with what that is?
Yes.
You're familiar with the DSM definition?
Yes.
That it's essentially faking a mental illness.
It's faking might not be the right term. It's sort of creating a set of symptoms for the purpose of secondary gain.
For incentives.
What's that?
That would be something like incentives.
Yes.
Incentives like avoiding a criminal prosecution.
That can be considered a potential secondary gain, yes.
Now, Dr. Riley, at one point you were actually concerned that the defendant might be malingering.
The defendant was malingering? What was the question?
Yes, at one point during your evaluation of the defendant, you were concerned that the defendant might be malingering.
My job is to consider everything before I make a diagnosis.
Yes, but in this case specifically, Dr. Riley, you were concerned the defendant might be malingering because he had inconsistent statements about his story.
So I review all the facts of the case. If there are discrepancies and inconsistencies, my job is to evaluate that, whether it's some form of malingering or whether it's an actual psychiatric illness. And that's why I came to a conclusion after reviewing the case that it was schizophrenia, it was not malingering.
Yes, but Dr. Riley, in your report, you cannot say for certain that this defendant is not malingering.
There's no 100% guarantee, as is never the case in psychiatric diagnoses.
So Dr. Riley, there is a possibility that the defendant is malingering.
There's a possibility, albeit very small, given my expert opinion and experience to date. I do think he has schizophrenia. And like I said, nothing is guaranteed. I cannot guarantee anything, but I'm fairly certain that he does have schizophrenia.
But it is a possibility, Dr. Riley.
It can be a possibility, but very, very small.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
Okay, any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, briefly.
Go for it.
Dr. Riley, after you evaluated Timothy Ray, did you think he was fit to continue performing his duties in the military?
No, he was not.
What recommendation did you make at that time?
I recommended that, he be discharged from the military.
Dr. Riley, did Timothy Ray ever tell you why he never reported symptoms or associated features to anyone else?
Yes, he did. He mentioned that, he did not want to be labeled mentally insane like his mother. And so he actually did not report any of these symptoms before for that reason.
No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. May the witness be excused.
Amen. Any further witnesses by the defense?
No, Your Honor. The defense rests.
Okay, are we ready to proceed to closings?
Your Honor, before we proceed to closings, the defense has a motion we would like to raise at this time.
Okay.
Your Honor, the defense raises a Rule 29 motion, judgment of acquittal. No reasonable juror, even looking at these facts in light most favorable to the non-moving party, could conclude that Timothy Ray premeditated his son's death, or that he had the mental capacity to understand what he was doing at that time. The court just heard from Dr. Riley, who told this court and the jury that Timothy Ray has suffered symptoms of schizophrenia going all the way back to 1986 when he was born, because his mother also suffered a mental illness. As you heard here today, a family history of mental illness makes someone more likely to also suffer a mental illness, such as schizophrenia. You also heard that Timothy suffered childhood trauma. As we heard today, childhood trauma also increases the likelihood that someone may, in fact, develop a mental illness later on in life. Furthermore, you heard about the progressive nature of schizophrenia today. and how in 2010, Dr. Riley initially diagnosed Timothy Ray with general anxiety. And after his symptoms and disease progressed over time, in 2019, Dr. Riley was able to determine to a medical degree of certainty that Timothy Ray did suffer from schizophrenia at the time of Nathan Ray's death. Therefore, our motion is due to be granted.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. As was stated earlier, Dr. LaGreca has argued that the defendant is in fact malingering, and that would be consistent with the symptoms that he has demonstrated, as well as the timeline of events to when the defendant first started exhibiting these symptoms. The symptoms that opposing counsel mentioned are not dispositive of schizophrenia, even if they were to exist. And therefore, we ask that this motion be denied.
All right, I will deny the motions. I believe it is going to be up to the jury. The two closing advocates, if I give you a 2-minute recess, is that going to be enough for you?
Can we have 5?
Well, tell you what, I'll give you 4 because that'll make it 4:15 by my clock.
That works for us, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, see you in 4. All right, is everybody ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we begin our closing arguments, we would like to request a time check.
Somehow I thought someone was going to ask me that. So state, you have 14 minutes and 11 seconds. And defense, you have 13 minutes.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. And before we proceed, any remaining time after the prosecution's closing argument, may we reserve that for a rebuttal?
You may. Yes.
Thank you, Your
So
Honor.
whenever you're ready.
On October 17th, 2018, what started off with spilled juice and a broken laptop turned into yelling. It turned into screaming, which turned into a beating, which ultimately led to the death of a 6-year-old boy, little Nathan Ray, killed at the hands of his own father, strangled with a belt. Now, this was a senseless act, and it was done. It was done by a man who had sense. It was a man who took intentional, deliberate, premeditated action to kill his son. The defendant made a dozen decisions leading up to Nathan's death, a dozen decisions that put a link in a chain of premeditation. Now, when the defendant left Nathan's room, when he walked down that hallway, when he walked through the threshold of his own bedroom, when he walked across the room, when he sat on his bed, when he took a moment, a period of reflection, he created that chain. It was when the defendant decided to stand up, when the defendant decided to walk over to his closet, when the defendant decided to reach into that closet, when the defendant decided to grab a belt, when the defendant decided to grab this belt, the defendant consciously chose to walk back down the hallway, back into Nathan's room, and he consciously decided to hit Nathan with that belt. He decided to take this belt and wrap it around Nathan's neck. He decided to squeeze tighter and tighter. He decided to leave that belt around Nathan's neck, and he decided to leave it there until Nathan's body was lifeless. Every single one of those decisions, every single link in that chain of premeditation could have been broken. Any one of those links breaking would have saved Nathan's life, but instead, the defendant chose to take it. Members of the jury, as the prosecution, we had the burden in today's case. We had the burden to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed first-degree murder. And to do that, we had to prove two elements. The first element is that the defendant actually killed Nathan. And the defendant met that burden for us. He confessed, not once, but twice. He confessed to Detective Booth, and then he confessed to Dr. Riley. Now, the second element that we had to prove to you was that the defendant killed with something called malice aforethought. Now, members of the jury, the judge just instructed you. She instructed you that malice aforethought can mean a killing that is premeditated. Every single one of those steps that the defendant took to kill Nathan, from the time he walked down the hallway to the time he grabbed the belt to when he wrapped it around Nathan's neck, the decision to squeeze tighter, the decision to leave that belt there until Nathan died, that is premeditation. The defendant forged his own chain of premeditation when he killed his son on October 17th, 2018. The prosecution has met our burden. Members of the jury, we weren't the only ones who had a burden in today's case. The defense had a burden as well. They had to prove to you all by clear and convincing evidence that the defendant actually has schizophrenia. They've failed to meet their burden. And you've heard why. Dr. LaGreca, an experienced psychiatrist with over 30 years of experience, told you that the defendant doesn't have schizophrenia. He told you that the defendant is malingering, faking it. And we know how. Schizophrenia is a progressive disease. It takes time. It does not turn on with a switch. And that's exactly what the defendant wants you to believe. The defendant wants you to believe, contrary to the medicine, contrary to the science, that schizophrenia just turns on and off. And you heard how the defendant wants you to believe that. It happened on October 19th, 2018. Officer Wentz told you the story. It was when she stopped the defendant at that sobriety checkpoint. That was when the switch happened. The defendant was in police custody. The defendant was stopped. The defendant didn't want to give his license, didn't want to give his registration. And then Officer Wentz did something that sent the defendant panicking. Officer Wentz took her flashlight and she shined it in the back of the defendant's car. And this is what she saw. A muddy shovel, bottles of bleach, trash bags that the defendant used to throw away Nathan and bury him in Brandywine State Park. And when the defendant realized Officer Wentz had seen this in his vehicle, he went from panic to survival mode. And he had three choices: fight, flight, or fake it. The defendant was too weak to fight. Flight was off the table at this point. He was already in police custody. So he had to fake it. He had to fake it. And it was only after he was in police custody that the defendant heard the CIA was after him, heard voices. He started acting erratic, doing jumping jacks. It was only after he was in police custody, it was only after he had been caught red-handed. Members of the jury, the defendant wants you to believe that he has schizophrenia, but the evidence doesn't support that. Now, it was the defense's burden to prove to you that he has schizophrenia. And you heard from two experts today. You heard from Dr. LaGreca, who told you the defendant is malingering, and you heard from Dr. Riley, who told you that the defendant has schizophrenia. So where does that leave you, members of the jury? At best, that leaves you with a coin toss, with a 50-50 chance. And that is not clear and convincing evidence. The defendant has not met the burden. The defense has not met the burden. The defense, they want you to think that there's only one explanation for why a father would kill his son, and that he has a severe mental illness. But you've heard other evidence today. You've heard evidence that the defendant was angry. You've heard evidence that the defendant was a ticking time bomb. With that, the prosecution agrees. He was angry at his estranged wife, Jessie. She'd been having an affair. She'd been having an affair for months with the next door neighbor. The defendant was angry. The defendant was angry, and when little Nathan spilled his juice and ruined his work laptop, he saw an opportunity. He saw an opportunity to get back at Jessie because he knew that Jessie was going to take Nathan, but was going to go be happy with someone else. And he got back at her that morning when he took what Jessie loved most, little Nathan. When he wrapped that belt around his neck and when he took Nathan's life. And now the defendant just wants to avoid accepting accountability. He wants to avoid responsibility for the horrific actions that he took against Nathan. But the defendant doesn't get to make that decision. Members of the jury, you get to make that decision. You make that decision when you go back into the deliberation room. And when you look at the overwhelming evidence that shows the defendant committed first-degree murder. And when you look at the lack of evidence to support that the defendant actually has schizophrenia, you will only come to one conclusion. Only one conclusion that will hold the defendant accountable and that will get justice for Nathan. You will find him guilty.
Okay. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Defense, are you ready to proceed with your closing? I think you're muted.
Sorry about
There you
that.
are.
Yes,
No worries. Whenever you're ready.
Timothy Ray has never been okay. Whether it be an abusive mother, a lonely life, an unfaithful wife, or the voices screaming at him from his own head, he has never been okay. Timothy is the product of a society that stigmatizes mental illness, where people think they have to keep their mental health issues to themselves. So Timothy buried his torment deep, and he kept it pent up until the voices took control, when this ticking time bomb finally exploded. No one here today is denying that what happened is a tragedy. The loss of Nathan Ray was brutal, but Timothy Ray did not intend to kill his son. And the state has spent most of the day trying to convince you that Timothy Ray was in his right mind when he did it. He was not. Because just like the state said in opening statements, no reasonable person would kill their own child. And we have shown that to you today. Now, in just a minute, the judge is going to give you this verdict form. And there are two choices here that the evidence here today and the testimony supports: not guilty and not guilty only by reason of insanity. When I was getting ready for this trial, I was trying to think of the best way to explain to y'all how you should fill out this verdict form. When I remembered this obstacle course at a summer camp I used to go to when I was a kid. Now, the last obstacle in this obstacle course was a rope wall. If you could get over that rope wall, you got to run and jump straight into the lake. But if you could not get over the rope wall, you could not jump into the lake. And just like we had to clear that wall before we could jump into the lake, the state has to prove their case before you can even consider our plea of not guilty only by reason of insanity. And the state has to prove every element of their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, the state failed to meet their burden today. Now I want to talk about what the evidence you've seen and the testimony you've heard here today have shown. First, the state gave you Detective Booth. And Detective Booth was the lead investigator in the Nathan Ray case. And she has went as far as saying that when conducting an investigation, you have to follow protocol to make sure everything is above the board. And the Skelton Police Department has protocol and directives. And evidence that a detective collects is covered under those protocols and those directives. And under that evidence is interviews. And these interviews are audio recorded and video recorded. Detective Booth had 30 days to request a copy before it was deleted, but she did not. And why didn't she? Because to Detective Booth, Timothy Ray was as guilty as the day is long. And after she decided that he was guilty, preserving those recordings just did not matter. She had 30 days to make sure everything was above the board, and she did not do it. Why not? Because Detective Booth was too close to the situation to be impartial. Like you learned today, Detective Booth met Timothy Ray in 2018 when their sons were on the same soccer team. Those boys played together. So throughout Timothy Ray's entire interview, all Detective Booth could see was Nathan Ray on the soccer field with her own son. And protocol be damned, because according to Detective Booth, Timothy Ray would be better off dead. Why is it important that we do not have this audio or video recording? Because, members of the jury, the demeanor of a schizophrenic patient is so important. And while we may get a glimpse of how much Timothy was suffering on the transcript, Detective Booth knew that the audio and video recording, that painted the full picture. And those recordings had to go away. Throughout the interview, Timothy Ray asked Detective Booth if she was in the CIA. He told her that they told him to kill his son, that they told him this and they told him that. Detective Booth was sitting across the table from a man who was suffering from mental illness, and she could not see it. And maybe she chose not to, or maybe she just didn't see it. And maybe she did not see it because since she had some mental health training 23 years ago at the police academy, she has taken no courses on mental illness. She has taken no training on how to handle a mentally ill suspect. Detective Booth was not prepared for a suspect like Timothy Ray. But today you heard from another officer, Officer Wentz. Officer Wentz has had hours of mental health training, and from the first second that she saw Timothy Ray, she knew something was off. She told you today that Timothy Ray was staring out. He was a zombie. He asked her if she was in the CIA, and he was doing jumping jacks on the side of the road until an officer had to pull a gun on him and make him stop. Is that something a sane person would do? Absolutely not. So what did Officer Wentz do? Officer Wentz followed her mental health training, de-escalated the situation, and placed Timothy in handcuffs to restrain him. Officer Wentz was prepared to handle a suspect like Timothy Ray, and she was shocked that an EMT did not come when help arrived because she knew he needed help. Now, the state also gave you an expert today, Dr. Mac LaGreca. And they paid Dr. LaGreca $14,250 to come in here, sit down, not even conduct his own interviews of anybody involved, look at what Dr. Riley did in his research, and come to an opinion. They paid Dr. LaGreca to ignore the overwhelming evidence that Timothy Ray is schizophrenic, and he was schizophrenic on the day that he killed his son. Dr. LaGreca ignored the paranoia, the delusions, the lack of hygiene, the disassociation from reality. He ignored it all. Dr. LaGreca ignored Timothy Ray's schizophrenia. Y'all, if I'm playing baseball and I get up to the plate and I go 3 for 3, I'm batting 1,000. And Timothy Ray is 3 for 3 under the requirements for a schizophrenia diagnosis of the DSM. He had 2 of the 5 symptoms. They were for an extended period of time, and they were not caused by another mental health issue or a substance. According to the DSM, Timothy Ray is batting 1,000. So how in the world can Dr. LaGreca come in here today, sit down, and tell you that Timothy Ray's faking it? He's malingering. Well, let's think of today's case like a game of cards. Dr. LaGreca came in, sat down, and was dealt a hand. And one of those cards in that hand, he did not like. So what did he do? He took that card, slid it off the table while you weren't looking, and tried to replace it with one that he pulled out of his sleeve. But luckily, y'all caught him. Dr. LaGreca did not like the fact that Timothy Ray showed symptoms and associated features of schizophrenia from the time he was 10 years old all the way until the time that he killed his son. So he came in here and told you that Timothy Ray was malingering. He replaced the symptoms with malingering. But luckily, Dr. LaGreca was not the only player at this table. Dr. Riley came in, sat down, and he was dealt a hand. And he was straightforward enough to play the hand that he was dealt. So let's talk about that hand. When Dr. Riley was asked to give an opinion today, he looked at everything. He looked at the good facts, the bad facts, the discrepancy. He looked at it all. He conducted an interview with Timothy Ray. He interviewed Timothy Ray's father, Timothy Ray's ex-wife, Jessica, his boss at work. He looked over the transcript of the audio and video recorded interview that Detective Booth conducted that we don't have the recordings from anymore. He looked at Detective Booth's testimony. He looked at Dr. DiGiuseppe's testimony and Officer Wentz's statements. He looked at everything. And Dr. Riley took the time to look at the hand he was dealt, deal with it, decide what was what, and place his bet. And y'all, his bet is a lock. He bet that Timothy Ray suffered from uncontrollable schizophrenia on October 17th, 2018, when he killed his son. And y'all, I know that the state's probably going to try and tell you, well, if Timothy Ray was really schizophrenic, Dr. Riley would have diagnosed him with it in 2010. But Dr. Riley was still dealing with a patient who could not be labeled mentally ill like his mother. And y'all, when we see hoof prints, we think horses and not zebras. And when Dr. Riley had a patient tell him that he had anxiety, depression, trouble sleeping, and stress, it was reasonable for him to make a diagnosis of general anxiety disorder. And they spent a lot of today trying to tell you that Dr. Riley, he is not a good doctor. But what do good doctors do? Good doctors are willing to change their diagnosis when they are shown new symptoms or new associated features, to admit that they were wrong for the good of their patient. And they've tried to distract you all day from the fact that Timothy Ray has shown symptoms for his whole life. They've tried to distract you from the full picture. So let's look at that picture. Today you learned that schizophrenia is a progressive disease, that genetics, abuse, all those things play into it. So let's look at what Dr. Riley saw when he saw the full picture. He took into account that in 1986, Timothy Ray was born to a mother with a mental illness who abused him, tick. He took into account that in 1996, Timothy Ray began hearing voices that continued throughout his entire life, tick. He took into account that in 2010, Timothy was suicidal, depressed, anxious, struggling to sleep, tick. He took into account that in 2011, he showed the same symptoms, tick. 2014, when he had crying uncontrollably, severe mood swings, anxiety, depression, broke down in Dr. DiGiuseppe's office, tick. 2015, when he was convinced that his son and wife were going to cut him up with a knife, tick. 2016 and 17, when he started seeing triangles on the wall, when he lost control in his own doctor's office and accused her of listening in on his phone calls, tick. In 2018, when the voices in his head got too loud to bear, when they were telling him, kill him, tick, punish him, tick, make him understand, tick, until the voices and the symptoms became too much and this ticking time bomb, he killed his son. What happened in this case is awful. The fact that an innocent 6-year-old boy lost his life is terrible, and it is worse that he lost his life at the hands of his own father. But Timothy Ray was not Nathan's dad on October 17th, 2018. Timothy Ray was not in the house. Only the voices remained. In just a minute, you're going to be given this verdict form, and you're going to take it back to make your decision. And there's 2 boxes here that the evidence supports. First, not guilty, because the state has not met their burden here today. Or because we met our burden, not guilty only by reason of insanity. We met our burden. The state did not meet theirs. Timothy Ray is not guilty. Find him not guilty.
Okay, thank you very much, defense. State, you have 4 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
The evidence clearly shows that the defendant killed his son with malice aforethought. And how do we know that? We know that because of the defendant's own words. We know that because of the time it took to strangle his son. We don't need a video recording of his confession to know that despite what the defense wants you to believe, that's exactly what happened. The defendant killed his son, and you heard every single step that the defendant took to get there. Now, we know that he killed with malice aforethought, and we know that the defendant is faking a severe mental illness. And we know that because malingering happens when there's an incentive. The defendant's incentive here, it's getting away with murder. But he's faking it. He's faking it. And you can fake an illness, but you cannot fake medical records. He was never diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was never diagnosed with schizophrenia by the defendant's own expert. Now, they show a man with depression, they show a man with anxiety, but not a man with schizophrenia. Not a man with an illness so severe that he takes his own son's life. Members of the jury, you have an opportunity here. Don't let him get away with murder. Find him guilty.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Take a deep breath. Round one is done.
Whoo!
I'm going to ask that all of the advocates, if you could go ahead, mute yourselves, mute your videos, but don't go anywhere yet. Our jurors, if you can complete your ballots, and then once that's done, if you could just, don't tell me what's on them, obviously, but just let me know when you submitted your ballots. Okay, jurors, I see that you've said you've submitted them. I'm just waiting to confirm that the host has received them, and then we can get into comments. So just stand by, hopefully only for a moment. Okay, all ballots submitted. So if I can have the advocates come back on. 1, 2, 3, so close.
He may have run to the restroom real quick.
Don't worry, just all of YouTube knows that now.
Sorry.
Yeah.
His computer. Yeah, something
Sorry.
happened. Oh, there we go.
My standing desk fell.
Oh, okay.
Sorry
Well,
about that.
congratulations. Round 1 is done. We're going to go into comments now. So I've just been asked to remind the jurors for timing. Please keep it to 1 comment per juror. So whoever would like to, and you can unmute your video at this point. Hello.
Hello.
Well, let's start with Ms. Strasser. You came up first.
Okay. First of all, I want to say great job to all you guys. You give me hope that that I can do trials on Zoom now. I've done a lot of depositions on Zoom, but I haven't tried a case on Zoom yet. But you guys give me hope that it's possible because you guys just did it. So thank you for showing me that. I thought for the prosecution, I thought you guys were good. I wasn't crazy about your theme. And I would have hammered that the defense expert had previously diagnosed the defendant with something else. But aside from that, I thought you guys did an excellent, excellent job. And you also, the timing of things that you focused on was really, really good. And for the defense, you guys were both great too. I did like your theme of the ticking time bomb. I thought you kind of harped on it a little bit too much with the constant tick, tick, ticking, but that's just me. Other people may have liked it. Overall, I did like that theme and I thought it worked really well for you. And I thought you guys did a great job with the using the DSM-5 and the symptoms to prove your case. And yeah, if I was actually a juror in this fact scenario, I would have a very difficult time deciding who won. So that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shayna. I, excuse me. I practice primarily criminal law. I clerk for a judge in Philadelphia, Common Pleas. And then I also run a nonprofit that works primarily in family law. So touched on a little bit of that side of my interests as well. You guys all did great. This is, I don't know if you have any classmates who have done other virtual trial team competitions, but it's definitely a whole new world and I commend you all for that. Also super impressed with all of the spaces that you are in. We have been doing Zoom court since May and truly, you know, you see people everywhere. It's funny seeing somebody, you know, arguing a motion, a bail motion or something, and they're like in their car driving back from the gym. It's weird. So you guys all look super sharp. So you're doing great. Okay, so quick tech comment. I don't know if this was happening for anybody else, but I had advocates quite frequently actually, right on top of the witness in a way that sounded like you had heard the witness's complete response, but I had not. So I don't know if you're already taking an extra beat, but double that beat that you're taking just for any lag on the tech side. It's okay to, you know, if people hear an extra beat in between, that's better than you talking over, especially when it's your witness. So I will say I first, Mackenzie, I'm sorry to call you out on it, but you were just the first one, you know, having the first direct that I noticed it. So I thought my initial comment was that you were being overly aggressive with your own witness, but I think it was more of a tech thing. So just be cognizant of it. for the people who don't know what your case is. Okay, so let's see. Everybody sort of has to be thoughtful that you can't out-expert your expert on direct or cross. So you're never going to slip them up on the science because they're the experts, right? So you have to get them on their prior statements. You have to get them on how thorough they were. You know, Pras, you unfortunately have an expert who never met with the patient, who's cracking your case open. That's hard. So you just have to be cognizant of that. Other side, just general trial advocacy, controlling your witness. If they're giving you a-huhs, stop, pause, is that a yes? First of all, for in real life, the stenographer can't record uh-huhs and uh-uhs, so you would need it to be clear yes or no or something to that effect. But also, you're not letting them slide away with a half answer, right? If you got them, let everybody know you got them. On the flip side, sometimes they give you a great answer to a question on cross and you get stumbled and you go, so is that a yes? I mean, if they beat you, they beat you. So just don't draw more attention to it. Let's see. Sorry, I took a lot of notes, but I want to be respectful of the time and everything. If the witnesses give you gold, take it, eat it up. You have a witness who's going into all this. Well, it could have been schizophrenia. It also could not be schizophrenia. That's not what the burden here is. It's clear and convincing evidence. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So to be honest, I didn't think it was a closed case. I think that this is a defense case on the way it's written. So, if the witness gives you stuff, take it, repeat it, put it into your close. Also, defense, and this is the last comment I will make. I don't know how many times you said guilty. It was a lot in your cross of Booth. I counted 6 or 8 times. You said you thought my client was guilty. You thought my client was guilty. If you say it enough, people believe it. So something to think about next time. Other than that, I thought all of the openings and closings were phenomenal. And you guys all did great. Thank you.
Thank you. You.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It looks like we've actually lost our third juror. So that's it for round 1. You're done until tomorrow.
All right. Thank y'all.
Guys. Best of luck to you all.
Thank you all